WordPress. My wife's an artist. Oh, okay. So I'm kind of a novice into WordPress, so it's not like I've got something to fix. So I apologize. It's not really, I thought I could learn from others in the session that perhaps were further along, obviously, and had sort of what the problems you might run into. So kind of a newbie into it, don't have a huge programming background, etc., but have dabbled in computers for a long time. So I'm just starting up on WordPress. So that's my background at this point, using Elementor and trying to do some training on just putting together a minimalistic website for my wife's art. She's a visual artist. So
have you tried? Have you tried any of the block editing, or the Gutenberg editor, block editor, and or the so-called full site editing themes?
Well, yeah, I've got Astra. It seems to be, fairly popular. I've dabbled in it in the past. I have more time right now, so just left my old position after 40 years, so I had a little bit more time. I dabbled in it for the last few years, but just literally dabbled. So I think what my decision is basically to sort of, there's just so much choice, is to get involved with. Well, Astra seems like a good theme. Elementor from the layout editor. So I haven't had the experience with the Gutenberg, the default editor, if you wish. I guess I'll learn whether the grass is greener to go in it. But so those are the two fundamentals to use to sort of to develop the site. Again, we're sort of going very slow. It's really more to get her artwork displayed on the net, which she hasn't ever done before, as opposed to going full e-commerce and things like that. That could come down the road. It's really walk before you run. Get a good functioning website. I have a QNAP cloud, a NAS that's where WordPress is on in the house. So we're on the intranet only. So using that as opposed to installing WordPress on my local PC, which is a laptop, just to for the conversation. So a little bit into the gaming as well sometimes. So that seemed to help. So it's a fairly, it's a couple of years old, but it's still in pretty good shape. So more than adequate for the WordPress at this point. So it's really at that point, it's just really learning. I'm sort of at that stage of learning things. And really the idea of, it was interesting that the Toronto user group popped up, just because I think ongoing that could be a good resource. Albeit for this particular topic, I'm just not evolved enough to give you guys any really good questions as to something that's not working on the website, since we really haven't. It's still very much into development. It hasn't been published yet or hosted externally on the internet yet. So
Ian, I'm sort of interested to find out what new users' reactions are to the block editor, and whether new users find it easy to use or not.
Well, as I said, I chose Elementor. I've gone through Devi and a few others over the last few years, and again, I just dabbled. I was busy enough with work and things like that. So my background was, I was IT enough to be IT to be dangerous type of person. So I'm not a classical programmer, that type of thing. I was more a business executive, but in the last few years, actually got into IT, but more around applications like Salesforce.com and things like that. So I always had developers who really knew their stuff, and I don't claim to be any close to that. In terms of the block editor, I mean, I think all my references with Elementor at this point, of course, it's pretty straightforward, drag and drop. It's really just understanding the various, I think it's evolved even in the last couple of years with WordPress. It has evolved, and it is pretty, as long as you can understand the basics, and I guess that's what I'm still trying to make sure I do understand the basics. The blocks, etc., I think are fairly straightforward. But there are nuances like everything. So it's just a matter of once you get it, then, you know, I think it's pretty darn straightforward. But again, you know, I've dabbled in things like this over the past. So, you know, but you know, everything, there are specifics to WordPress and Elementor, and so you do have to get a little bit deeper into, you know, you have to read the manual to some degree or look at some videos and that type of thing. It's not, you know, you can get lost, you know, there's no doubt. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, obviously you're finding Elementor a comfortable tool to use. Is that correct?
Yeah, at this point, again, I think one of the things with WordPress, there's so much darn choice. It can be a bit of a problem just because, my God, there's just so much out there.
But you have chosen the most popular page builder in Elementor and
Right.
most popular theme by actually a fair margin. I think it's probably got 50% more users or active sites than the next most popular theme. So, you know, on those two grounds, you know, you're with lots of company, and you know that those products will be well supported because there's a big investment in them on both the part of the developers as well as users. Right. And those are really good indicators, positive indicators. Just going to Drew's question, I think one of the things that's tough about the block editor is that it's still very much a moving target, and that things that people might not like about it a couple of weeks ago literally may have changed now or will be changed in a couple of weeks. One of the things though that is different in this phase of WordPress is that they've created this learning space on the WordPress.org site, just under the label menu Learn. And within it, there's a section called Learn WordPress Online Workshops, which are Zoom meetups. And they go through beginner and intermediate level stuff related to, you know, Gutenberg, the block editor, the new WordPress. And I'm not sure where we'd be without those webinars. I think I've attended 3 dozen of them since mid-December. And things that came up in January were different issues and problems in February, than March, than April and May. But by the fall, with 6.1, if it comes out as it's planned and it can deal with custom post types and making template creation and management smooth and straightforward, then those are probably the two biggest things right now that are sort of giving people headaches. But we now have an amazing variety of blocks. The third-party block plugin libraries of blocks you install with plugins are awesome in their variety. But in the same way as the issues with themes, how do you choose a theme? The issue with blocks is there's no generic terminology to describe what they are or do. And so therefore you really can only be sure that a given block is what you want by installing it and trying it. You can't go by its label. We've seen examples of, you know, a core block alongside a third-party block, and they do essentially the same thing, but you'd never guess that from their labels or their names. So it would be a very fruitful development if we had a generic scheme for the terminology of blocks. Call it whatever you like, but then use one of the, you know, following 75 generic terms to describe or categorize what it is. And I think that means that until that sort of thing happens, you're sort of stuck to going for someone's third-party library of blocks and trying it out and see how far you get it. But if you want to back out of that and go to someone else, that is not a non-trivial operation. Right. Because when you remove the plugin that brought you blocks, the blocks still work, but you can't change their settings. So that could
Okay.
become a headache in some respects.
Yeah, Ian, to echo Robin's point, you made a good choice also in choosing the Astra theme. An awful lot of the problems that we spend our time dealing with on this meetup is people who've bought a horrendously complicated theme on ThemeForest, just run their site completely into the ground, and then we figure out how their theme works.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I think there's a pretty large gulf between the well-known developers and the popular themes, and then the other 30,000 themes that are out there, which for a variety of reasons you can only evaluate by installing them and using them for a few months. And of course,
Right.
that is an unreasonable expectation on the part of any developer. And so from the point of view of someone who's not experienced in WordPress, I mean, and I've looked over the years many times for criteria to evaluate themes in some objective fashion, and there just isn't any. That's just not something that anybody ever seems to be interested in. And the result is that a theme could be wonderful, but if it wasn't written up on WordPress Tavern or some other credible, popular site, then you'll never hear about it, or have it evaluated by somebody, as in the case of that particular blog, where the writers have developer backgrounds, and so they're quite good at pointing out things which are relevant to us, and you can tell from the comments that these are positively received evaluations, whatever their slant or conclusion about a given theme. And so I think that we just don't have enough of those resources at work to help the vast majority of people who are theme or plugin hunters. Well, you look at, for example, I don't know, pick almost any category, SEO plugins. There are 3 or 4 popular ones that are well rated, and then probably, I don't know, 30, 40 of them that fall below that, some of which I'm sure are terrific, but it's not practical for most of us to do anything with them unless we know somebody who said, hey, I stumbled across SEO plugin X, and I had this feature or that feature which I really, really like, and from that point of view, it makes sense. But it's, you think in the world where publishing and content creation is of the essence of the platform, that these kinds of problems wouldn't exist in this particular way. But it just goes to show that well, let me give you another example. If you look at the documentation for the Gutenberg project, the block editor and the site editor, it really suffers from poor information architecture. The way in which things are organized to navigate and be findable is pretty close to atrocious. And the terminology used, you'd almost think they were trying to confuse people. It just, some of the issues are so bizarre in terminology that I just scratch my head. But this is a very large community and ecosystem. And those things that I just mentioned don't have the interest level that many other topics do that people line up to participate in. But the terminology we use for WordPress doesn't fall within that range of popular topics.
Right. Okay, well, thank you for the feedback. That's good. Need some notes.
Rolf, is that how I pronounce your name? Have I pronounced it correctly? Rolf, unmute yourself.
At the bottom there. Listen, I've run large software development organizations, okay, over the course of my career, and I came to WordPress afterwards. The biggest issue that I find is that there is no guiding light in the community. When I ran software development organizations, I said, for instance, here are a bunch of architectural principles you will all adhere to. They're maybe not the best. They may not be, but they're good enough to give us our results, and they create a cohesion and a coherence in the work we do. That's, to me, in the last 2 years that I've been in the WordPress community, that kind of coherence is totally and completely missing. And the social structure necessary to create that can't exist in a community of independent-minded individuals who all are looking for innovation or who are looking for income from the plugins and the themes they sell. And so I don't expect that world to ever change in WordPress, simply because of the nature of the social organization of the community which is around it.
I would just interject, though, that a fairly significant group forming the sort of the core of the developers of the developers of the core of WordPress are in fact employees of the large concerns, particularly Automatic, which is WordPress.com and other things, but also like WP Engine, GoDaddy, and a handful of others. And they're pretty sophisticated fellows, but you are exactly, I agree with you 100% that it's the social construct that we work within in WordPress that makes these things relatively difficult, and explains, I think, why the topics that I mentioned and happen to be interested in seem to have so little traction. And yet at the same time, if you drop in on the Slack channels for the training team or the documentation teams and so on, they're quite open to contributions, suggestions, ideas, guidance, what have you. But it would be, in my case, it's not feasible for me to devote a day a week or, even the 5% a month that WordPress asks for the simple reasons that I'm doing other things and making other contributions to WordPress. And so dropping them in favor of working on documentation, for example, has much less appeal than it might otherwise have.
Yeah, but my job as the lead software developer was to exclude large numbers of possibilities.
Yes, yes.
So that we could, in fact, be very focused and disciplined in what we did. We got good enough tools, and we said those other tools are very interesting and are very useful, and for some other set of people they might be the right choice, but they're outside of our world. There's no such integrating discipline in the WordPress community.
Well, one of the attendees in our session a couple of months ago was developing the design guide for a large institution which would govern how all software development was to be managed and developed within the organization. And it was interesting because he said, he was as surprised as everyone in the organization that they made this commitment to a centralized sort of controlling function, but that was to achieve what you're talking about,
Exactly.
Which was a systematic, thoughtful, documented, proactive approach to the way things were done, the tools that are used, the strategy in the way things are done. And so he was found it quite disappointing in the WordPress world because he saw no evidence whatsoever that that this way of thinking about things was gaining any kind of a foothold.
But you see, it is a community of independent developers, right? As opposed to a team focused on delivering results for an organization. And
well, it has a bit of the characteristics of the second, but it's primarily the first.
Right, and the characteristics of the second probably exist in organizations like Automatic or whatever the name is, rather than the general community. I don't think that's bad. I just think it creates a lot of headaches.
Well, yeah, I think it does mean that the debugging process plays a different and larger role than would otherwise be the case. And that's part of the reason why people express disappointment in Gutenberg, is because they don't appreciate the magnitude of the change, the number of years that it takes, and the volunteer nature of the community is such that you can't, by fiat, sort of set priorities. Although to a fair extent that does occur because of Mullenweg's personal sort of influence, he still styles himself the lead developer on Gutenberg, even though he has full-time people who play subordinate roles, I think do the majority of the actual work. He
That's
still
normal.
feels responsible for it overall. And I guess I think it's pretty ballsy of him to have sort of set off in this path. But then, you know, the Wix and Squarespaces and other competitors at the low end were going to start eating WordPress's lunch if they didn't come up with a much better UI and much easier starting up sites in a CMS context than had been the case. And so whether it's starter templates or sort of pre-configured sort of startup sites, which you have to work with right from the get-go, no blank pages or sort of empty pages are to confront you. That's one of the key sort of improvements. And so that hasn't paid off yet because it's still early days, but the potential is pretty significant.
Yeah.
If I could go off on just a tangent for a minute, something interesting is happening to me right at this moment. In the last 5 minutes, I've gotten about 4 phishing phone calls from, it sounds like India. But what they have managed to do is really interesting. I have my phone set to filter those out because they only filter, it only accepts calls from people in my address book. But what you know how phishing callers will use fake phone numbers. What they have done is sent a fake caller ID that is identical to the CIBC customer service number. So it comes up on my phone as recognized as CIBC customer service. Unfortunately, when you get them on the phone, they're not very convincing. But I'll say they're persistent. It's 3 or 4 calls in the last few minutes.
Where do we refer these spam text messages? Is there some authority in Canada that we can send them to? I've been hit twice by this Netflix scam where they send you a text message that your subscription payment for the current month failed. While they sort that out, would you please check and update if necessary your credit card info? And then they provide a link with Netflix in the domain name of the link. Not only Netflix, but Netflix is sort of like the thing you notice. And I happened to catch me in a moment when I wasn't paying attention, and I clicked the damn thing, checked my credit card stuff, it looked fine, and then realized that, you know, I'd probably been scammed, and immediately locked my credit card account so that it couldn't be used, and then got a replacement card sent to me by urgent delivery with a new account number. But then the next month, the same thing happened with a slightly different domain name. And so, you know, so I think what you're saying and what I'm agreeing with is that the scammers are ever more sophisticated and able to work the system in these ways. And as you say, that if they can look like CIBC customer service, then, I mean, you could phone customer service, right? And get the CIBC, right?
Yeah, and the big problem is that it's trivially easy to create a fake caller ID.
Yes.
There's absolutely no security on the caller ID protocol. And that is something that really ought to be changed. That would cut down 90% of these spam calls if they just had authenticatable caller IDs.
I wonder why that hasn't happened, because if it is straightforward, it wouldn't deprive the telcos of anything important that they've got now with the loose security on that feature to this point. So if they locked it down, what would they lose? I mean, is that technically it can't be very difficult.
But there's no economic incentive for them to do so, period.
So if I can interject here, interesting discussion. number one, I have a big, having worked for a major software company, actually major hardware company back a few decades ago now. My number one thing I see is many of the developments you see in applications being changed and Windows being changed and so on. I swear there are project managers trying to justify their jobs because, you know, Word works. I don't need another fix to it. You might need an add-on for, like I have an add-on for sending faxes, but you know, all that stuff goes on. When it comes to what you were talking about, text messages, how many of you have received an offer of your Rogers rebate via a text message? Because it turns out, this is one thing I learned, and it came through, I think, Mobile Syrup. He pointed out, you can go into those text messages. You sort of have to press on the content of the message. It's not easy. You press on the content of the message, and there's a menu comes up, and you click on the copy more, and then there's an arrow pops up, and you can forward that text message to 7726, which happens to say spam. That goes back to Rogers, and they block the person. So, you know, I know Rogers is, and I think Bell as well, are trying to do a lot of spam blocking at their end, but somehow these things get through. But it was
I think what they found is that blocking doesn't work insofar as the numbers are so easily obtained or fraudulently obtained that you could spend your life blocking everyone, and it hasn't made any significant difference. It's still worth doing. I mean, with Apple, for example, they sometimes ask, you know, is this spam? Would you like to notify us that it's spam? And when I've done that, I haven't heard anything come back. And so you sort of wonder, what's the point of that if there's no follow-up, and you get no satisfaction from that. But as soon as those, remember the Ontario license plate refunds? That was immediately jumped upon for these text messages, you know, click here to get your refund. So as soon as there was discussion of Rogers crediting customers, the news reports all consistently said, but beware of text messages. This is not going to go out with a text message. So those are scammers. And so I think, you know, from a public safety point of view, perhaps we're becoming a bit better educated, but it's still a pain in the ass to sort of fend off all these attempts to deprive us of our hard-earned money and peace of mind. And having once succumbed, touch wood again, but recovered quickly from it, you know, I can't believe that I got caught, you know, or fell for something, but it was sort of late in the day. I was tired. I just wanted to get the last detail done. And I wasn't paying attention. And those are all good reasons not to do something.
There's also the message that comes out from Rogers about, supposedly Rogers, about, oh, we need to, we're going to stop your email, or Rogers email account. If you don't catch up on your payments or something like that. So gradually, you know, if I see those, I try to do a screen capture and put it up on Facebook so other people are warned. But God, it's an ongoing. I remember when the internet started, and I was with a software company that was developing a browser, and very quickly we figured out the biggest issue with the internet was going to be security. And look at where it's at today with all the applications out there, and yet with scamming and spamming and everything else still goes on.
On the internet, everywhere is a bad neighborhood.
Yeah.
Or at least anywhere can be a bad neighborhood, because perception being the problem, right, is what it looks like, and what it is may not be the same thing in many cases. I mean, that is kind of the point of the internet too, right? Present yourself as you wish to be, not as you are.
Hmm.
Actually, the thing that strikes me about the Rogers outage, that I guess goes to our absence of any form of competition regulation or monopoly regulation, is that one of the core ideas behind the internet way back when in its early days was its resiliency and the fact that nobody could take down the net as a whole, because, as they would say in those days, you could route around any difficulty, and therefore it was an ideal network for military purposes, which is where I guess it was DARPA that originally funded it. But the problem is that the Canadian federal regulators don't believe it's necessary for there to be a public backbone or infrastructure for the internet, and then let the telcos and internet service providers tap into it for their own customer purposes. But that means that nobody should be able to take it down because of the redundancy that could be built into it. And that this feature of the web's design has been lost because it's more profitable that we have outages, but give control of clients to monopolies.
Well,
Carve out their own separate little territories and areas, reach agreements with each other about pricing and sales promotions, and then they can relax and go to the cottage for the summer.
well, I have two comments. One, I ran Y2K change management, and no change went in without two questions being asked, and I enforced it. Number one, what's the worst that could happen if this change fails? Obviously, nobody asked that question at Rogers. And two, what's the recovery process if that failure does happen? That to me is a lack of professional competence, period. Right?
Well, there's a wholly different approach that can be taken based on my experience at the Invictus Games. I was on IT support for Invictus Games. And we had 2 laptop computers at Nathan Phillips Square. One was in a St. John's ambulance truck over near the old city hall. The other was just on a table near the change room. And so St. John's ambulance truck had a power source. The other side didn't. And yet we had this device. It's a ZTE device that goes straight from cellular to Wi-Fi. And you can actually, I've found it's available on Dell. But that device, there's a long story there, but I ended up I had access. I don't know if at Invictus Games you noticed there was a TV studio on the middle of the Queen Street balcony. And it turns out the manager of that studio was the grandson of my father's best friend from World War II. So we're trying to solve this problem. I finally phoned Mark and I said, can we install this Wi-Fi device up at or near the studio? So we put it up beside the studio and everything worked beautifully. But that's the sort of device that, they need to take that device for your home internet. There's a different one for your phone. For your home internet, just supply every home customer with that device and have it flip over to say Bell or TELUS if the Rogers network is detected to be down.
I mean, isn't that an incredibly trivial thing when you are dealing with a router, right? We all have routers now at home in our offices. Once upon a time, dealing with a router was like doing your own sort of deep system configuration in a Unix box, because that's where routers, got the technology to run them. And now they're basically idiot-proof. So why not drop in a feature that enables this switching of networks? Apparently the same thing can work with phones because of these eSIM cards that don't have a physical requirement of a SIM, but rather it's a software thing so that you can switch from one provider to another without physically doing anything with the phone.
Yeah, that's the solution on the phone side.
Long ago, have dual SIMs so that you could be on 2 networks with one phone. But obviously the telcos didn't like that idea because it obviously would foster competition. And I guess it's
Well, the ministry has said, fix that problem. You've got to make sure there's a rollover backup. They want an answer in 60 days as to how the networks are going to work together. So that if one fails, you roll over to another one.
So how
but how
come,
much confidence? How much confidence can you have in those regulators when it's only now that it's occurring to them to bring this up? Any one of us with a position of responsibility would have thought of this on the first day of the job, wouldn't you think? Wouldn't you say?
I have two questions. One, how come the Rogers failure killed my Bell internet for over 2 days? No one's explained that to me yet. Two, Canada has a history, Canadian government has a history of doing public infrastructure with a few big firms. Started with the railways, went to the telecoms, and is now in the
Airlines, trains.
This is a social dynamic, not a technology issue.
Right.
Well, the problem is that these infrastructure projects require huge amounts of capital investment, and so
But is that really, Drew, is that really so huge in this modern economy, in which you look at what the pandemic did to us and how quickly the government was prepared to drop tens of billions of dollars because it thought that we would accept that? I don't think it's money. I think it's the will on the part of the politicians and the confidence that they can persuade us that this is useful and beneficial. Instead of having the 2030 Olympics, we could have a publicly owned internet backbone from coast to coast, well, the whole 3 Cs, I guess, including the North, for the price of one passed on Olympics for Vancouver in 2030.
Yep. When I was growing up, the church elder in my church was the vice president of regulatory affairs for Bell Canada. I can remember very distinctly him sitting me down one day when I was starting to develop a business career and said, the biggest single risk that Bell faces is lack of control of the CRTC, not our technology, not our internal operations. The biggest risk we face is losing control of the CRTC. We must always be in control of that bureaucracy. And I think it's as true today as it was 40 years ago.
Well, I think we saw recently about meetings between the head of Bell and the head of CRTC, didn't we?
Yeah.
There were some stories there, but it's a question of, you've got this technology and how do you implement it? And governments have not been very good at that over the years.
But again,
yeah, but I think one of the core things that we're talking around is the fact that risk mitigation is a cost.
Right.
And so therefore, why would anybody in their right minds incur a cost when they don't have to? And so at this point in time, outages are acceptable because they save money. And so if they didn't look at the consequences of a botched, router changeover, it was probably because they saved some money doing that. And they just said, hey, let's skip the 10 guys who would do this evaluation and just jam it through. Because what are the odds? The odds are it'll work. And if it doesn't work, what happens? So customers are out for a day. Big deal. Who cares?
Well, we've already seen an example of that where they tried to get these 2 or 3 new wireless providers on board in the last few years. And where are they now? They're being bought up by the big 3. We got the Rogers Shaw situation at this point in time, but it was Public Mobile and Wind Mobile. They've all gone. They got acquired by the big 3 because the big issue is you got to find a financier to pay the bill to get the network up.
Well, that it's worth more to a monopolist to pay over price on an innovative young company than it is to compete with them 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, perhaps to their great detriment. And that if you look at, for example, the social media companies in the States, there's nothing more characteristic in their business strategies than the crucial importance of buying up the competition before it can be big enough to actually hurt them.
Yeah.
And so that's literally, a half a dozen companies a month at a minimum. And so after you bought up 250 companies and snuffed 225 of them, you can relax. And I think that, the sort of what I learned in business history was that the goal of every monopolist This is the quiet life. And who in their right mind would not want a peaceful, profitable existence in that way? So they're doing the smart thing for sure.
It's interesting that we'll see what happens. It's interesting what happens when that doesn't happen. Blockbuster Video famously turned down an opportunity to buy Netflix when it was just a little upstart.
When it was doing physical DVDs.
Yeah, and now Blockbuster Video still has a monopoly in selling VHS cassettes from one store in Bend, Oregon.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, you know,
Netflix itself is running into the problem of declining subscriber acquisitions, and now looking at this advertising model. And I like YouTube for a number of reasons, but I find the advertising method they use so intrusive that it really limits my use to sort of 10 minutes, 15 minutes maximum before it irritates the hell out of me. And really, so I must, if I want to watch YouTube, I have to subscribe to get rid of the ads. And I guess that's life, right? I mean, if you don't pay, you're the product. And it was pretty straightforward that, the data was everything. And so what's going to happen now in the future when data is not so easily obtained and it's rather rigorously policed as far as who you can sell it to on which continent and legal jurisdiction?
Yeah, the European governments are getting increasingly agitated about the data marketing business.
Well, they brought in this new digital services legislation that is pretty hefty. The only problem with their very good intentions and excellent work is that they haven't put the bucks into the enforcement side and left it to countries like Ireland to sort of be home base for many, overseas headquarters because of a very slack approach to enforcement, and which has tightened up. And they've gone after Apple and Google and so on lately, but like a year ago, that was a lost cause. That as long as you were headquartered in Ireland, you could basically flaunt breaking the rules for the EU because Ireland wasn't going to enforce the rules against you if you were big enough and wealthy enough.
And I wonder if these companies will always be able to find some safe haven country somewhere in Europe that wants their business enough to leave them alone.
Well, I think that they've learned something from the case of the Irish, and that that for some reason Ireland was, like an outlier, and that has not been a problem with any other country. And you'd think some of the countries in Europe that are small and poor, would have taken advantage of this, and apparently they haven't. And so there must be something there from a political point of view that has made a difference.
Or their politicians are just stickingly unsophisticated.
Well, they're not. I mean,
They don't
taking a
understand the
bag of money
possibility.
or a briefcase full of cash doesn't take much sophistication.
Well, you have to at least understand that there's a technology can create a briefcase of cash. Some of the political people that I've dealt with around technology don't even understand that.
True.
And yet they govern technology.
Yeah.
One of the problems in some of the European countries, I did a lot of work with Skype. This was when I was with AST, the board company. And those were the days that, we had the top selling add-on boards for PCs. And my international boss out of California went to fire his Belgian manager. Did he ever open up a can of worms? Because European law,
because the HR regulations.
Well, yeah, they had to give him like a year's worth of salary, like several $100,000 to satisfy the Belgian regulations and so on. And that was one of the driving factors for most of those operations going to Dublin.
Jim, I remember the AST 6-pack.
Oh, do I ever? I sold.
Isn't it a company owned by some Chinese characters?
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
Out in
Albert
Scarborough
Safi.
somewhere?
It was Albert, Safi, and Tom. Safi was from Pakistan.
Ah,
Albert and Tom were from Hong Kong. But Safi had a special connection with Canada because his father had been the Pakistan ambassador to Canada. So he knew Ottawa very well too. But yeah, they ran that. They ended up selling it to, what was the Korean company? I forget. In the end, anyways, and it sort of all disappeared. I mean, we were actually selling full scale IBM PCs in competition with IBM and Compaq. And we were doing very well with all the dealers who couldn't get IBM and Compaq licenses.
well, those are the days of the white label products too, right?
Yeah,
Anybody could open up a retail store, buy in some gear, put their own label on it, and produce pretty reasonable PCs. I mean, I can remember before moving permanently or semi-permanently into the Apple world, you know, the last PC built out of all individually selected parts, and it was quite an exercise. I mean, it was a fascinating one in many respects because you got to choose the processor and the box and the memory and the drives and the other peripherals you plugged in. And it rarely took more than a half a day to put all together.
we even sold interfaces to the IBM 3270s and IBM 5250
Really?
frames.
Hmm.
And those were just add-on cards you put in the boxes.
Yeah.
This new computer I got, the original one I got didn't have an extra memory card. It used whatever, or not memory card, an extra video card. When I went to replace it, they could only give me one with an extra video card. So I taken advantage of that. They didn't charge, Dell didn't even charge me extra for it.
Cool.
But that was the configuration they could make for me. So,
But now the machines like the iMac are sealed units that can't be upgraded. If a component fails, you're basically out of luck. And even something like the 27-inch screen, which is a lovely piece of monitor gear, isn't really usable in any way with anything else other than the onboard Mac processor and video. You can't plug it in.
Those have a use. So there's a new building for engineering at the University of Toronto. It's called the My Hall Center. It's an 8-story building packed in the parking lot that used to be behind Convocation Hall. It has no lecture rooms, but it has one big multimedia gathering room. But as you wander around the building, you see these screens talking about various aspects in the building. Well, those are all sitting on iMacs. And so it's the person in charge at that center who can set up what is going to be displayed in those screens. And it's a wholly different function from the point of view of you and I worrying about a MacBook to get sort of maximum flexibility of programs and so on. In this case, those are for, you know, which I say,
Display purposes.
pardon?
I think they're called kiosk machines because
Yeah,
they can do either just display or some limited sort of functionality, like, you know, here's a map of the mall, you know, here's where you can go, something really trivial from a computation point of view, but are locked up as far as all the other capabilities they've got. So
it's basically information displays.
yeah.
And but on the other hand, you know, the people I work with in engineering alumni, they all have their MacBooks or their IBM PCs and do their thing.
Well, I guess we're not going to get any people coming tonight looking for help since we've been up for what, an hour, and no, I don't think I've been to one of these sessions where nobody came who was in need, and we had such a good group of people to field questions, and if not provide answers, at least how to go about solving a problem, which we all know lots about from our vast experience with trial and error.
It's an evolving world.
Yeah. So here's somebody new. Christian. Are you
Yes,
there, Christian?
Yes, I am. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, can you turn on your video?
I can. One moment. Well, first and foremost, what an interesting conversation. Came on here for WordPress, and I got a little bit of history and all of those other things. So that's always amazing. Can you guys see me now?
Yes.
You can.
All right, great. Yeah, so in regards to WordPress, so I'm a developer. I have my own biz. I usually do mostly web maintenance for a whole bunch of clients. Made a couple sites from nothing into something. Usually I help small businesses just redefine their digital footprint and either take it to another level or pretty much reassess their needs. A lot of people I'm finding have a website, whether it be WordPress or sometimes static HTML sites. And they have like legacy developer remnants of solutions left over, and they have all of these, you know, the website becomes this like cobweb filled attic that no one wants to go into.
Isn't the technical term for that cruft? K-R-U-F-T?
I've never heard of that word, but maybe.
Well,
Yeah.
it's sort of like the notion of cobwebs, but only a lot
Right.
harder to scrape off.
Sure.
Actually,
Yeah,
I should
so-
Google that and just see whether there's a definition comes up. But sorry to please go ahead.
That's okay. That's okay. I learned a new word, cruft. So, so yeah, so they come to me with these things, and some of the users, different walks of life. You know, some are just like young startup people, and others are like 40 years home appliance repairman. You know, and one person told him in like the early 2000s, get a website, you need it. And then it was built, and then he doesn't use anything on it. All he does is get phone calls from it. So I'm starting to think, and it'd be interesting to think what you guys have to say. Does everyone need a website these days? And with the emergence of landing pages and how easy it is to link landing pages to email, like MailChimp and those kind of like software suites where you're getting the communication out there, you're promoting your business and you're connecting with potential leads. Like sometimes I feel, I'm talking to my clients and I feel that they don't need a website. You know, they need something that's very shallow. They don't need files and databases and the depths of all of that programming and stuff.
Wouldn't the starting off point be, to answer your question, that there's a fork in the road between those sites which are content creation, publishing, distribution in nature as their primary purpose, and all the other sites, a significant portion of which are business related. So if what you're doing is looking to publish information for one reason or another, it's pretty hard to beat a website. If you are doing business, then it really depends on the business you're in and the way you're conducting it. But I think your point on landing pages is well taken, in that the potential from a marketing point of view or any kind of promotional point of view of being able to do something and then receive feedback or responses or bring traffic in to a sophisticated page specific to that particular campaign or promotion or whatever is invaluable. And really page builders can sort of earn their keep just in that particular area of website of use. But the fact of the matter is that most people who have sites, they're not running smoothly enough for them to feel like they've got time to devote to an enhancement, or the business of running a website has enough frustration in it that the idea of deepening their commitment and dependence on it with a landing page capability that they use, every 2 weeks or at least once a month, I think is daunting.
It definitely depends. I know that it definitely depends on the business. If it's an repair guy or an artist or a visual artist or a photographer or something. I totally get that. But it's just interesting. I just feel like there's a dialogue that never happens. It's just like, it's the year 2020 plus, you need a website. It's funny because there's never a discussion. And I feel like sometimes these people that call me, sorry to cut you off, sir, but they call me excited to get a website, but we don't end up I don't mean to shoot them down, but I'm like, I think this is way too much of going to be a.
So there's a company in Ottawa that takes care of that. If I order stuff on Facebook now, I get a notification about deliveries. I get updates on progress back. I get handles the payments. Try Shopify. I think Shopify has found a huge market for companies that need a web-based interface, but has put in the infrastructure behind it so that you can run your business without having to set up all these e-commerce type details.
Yeah.
And of course, the other one in that regards is Amazon and their merchant services. But I think Shopify, I find, pops up in lots of these places where I order stuff off Facebook, that sort of stuff.
Right.
In fact, there's an application I have from Shopify that just tells me the progress of my shipments, so on, and is also.
I do recommend Shopify sometimes when it's going to be like, I know it's going to be a huge success and they have a lot of products to launch and there's going to be like a lot of moving parts, but the cost of Shopify does deter like a lot of people. And the programming language Liquid, I'm not too big on it. I don't really like it that much. So when it comes to customizing, then, you know, if you don't know what you're doing within the Liquid language, then you have to like hire. So then I have to hire out and I have to hire like a Liquid developer.
All I'm saying is that look at the success the company has had. I see they're doing some cutbacks. I actually, 2 years ago, we stayed at an Airbnb in Ottawa, visiting my daughter family. And it turned out the owner was a Shopify manager. And he worked out of the upstairs and we had the downstairs for his apartment. And he was actually going to turn the upstairs into an apartment and move 100 miles out of Ottawa to be a Shopify employee.
Christian, when you want to know whether a company should have a website, the question you need to ask is, where do they get their customers from? If it's a corner store and their customers are foot traffic who just happen to walk by, they're not going to get a lot of value out of a website. If their customers actually find them on the internet, then a website is pretty important.
Yeah.
I think as well that the sort of very closely connected question for people starting sites or getting their first site is twofold. First of all, few people seem to recognize up front the amount of effort that's required on their part to produce the content required to make its site workable or usable for the purpose intended. And they tend to look at that as either something that can be sort of knocked off almost as a trivial task, or that somebody will somehow do it for them magically. And when they get into the sort of grind of producing the stuff for the site, then all kinds of difficulties arise. And I think I forget now what my second point was. It'll come back to me. Go ahead, Rolf, and you were going to say something.
Well, what I always ask is, if the internet wasn't there, would you need a brochure to run your company? Right? And if the answer is yes, then you've got one reason for having an simple information providing site. The second reason is lots of people, particularly younger people, treat the internet as a source of social proof. So if you run a business where people are going to go take a look at who else is using your business, then that's another reason for having a simple site, because lots of people now depend on social proof on the internet. They want to see recommendations and faces and that kind of stuff. That's another reason for having it. But, I've got 6 brothers and sisters. Not one of them has a site. They live on Facebook. That's their site, right? Because all they use it for is gossip and social exchange, right? And they don't need a site for that. So I think that's the other thing you need to look at is just, what are the business kinds of issues? Do you need a brochure where? And the other question that I often, and how simple can you keep it? Not enough people ask that question. The simpler it is, the better off you are. If all you need is a few pages, there's some really good tools for generating a few pages these days.
Yeah.
I remember the point that I was going to make in addition to this question about producing the content. And that is that in my background with large enterprises and content management systems way back when, requirements were a really important phase of a project. When you sat down and did your best to evaluate what was going to be involved. But even in the best of circumstances, the problem often was that you were in effect creating a new product. And so there was no one who really had a clear picture of what was going to be involved or necessary. So projects often took major changes in direction before they were even a third of the way through. And so it was the combination of the difficulty of doing requirements as an intellectual and business exercise. And then secondly, the fact that in developing new products, you can't go by past experience. You can't go by previous models that have worked. You have to think things through in a new way if you want to produce something innovative. And that is one of the most challenging tasks that anyone can undertake. And so it isn't without good reason that good sites in this respect are hard to produce, because they demand effort and talent that most people don't know to bring to bear, or if they do know, they don't have it.
Interesting. And then lastly, I do have to run, but just generally, you guys were talking about content builders. I found in my experience that Elementor is quote unquote more like the most solid. I usually don't use, sorry, my dog is just bothering me. I don't use Gutenberg. I don't use the stock WordPress. I just feel restricted when I'm using it. So, and I know that with something like Divi or any of these other ones, you know, Elementor, I know that I can find what I'm looking for in like a widget or in a plugin or in something, and I can just add it to the site. In the development of these sites though, however, I do find that in the builders themselves and then in my browser, it's two different layouts. The layout in the building, in my building, I guess environment within the builder, it looks one way, and I'll design my site in the builder, and then once I put it onto, say, you know, on the staging site, and I look at it in my browser, things aren't lining up the way they were in the builder. And I'm just wondering, do you guys experience that? There's like this like break. So I end up like, when you look at the finished product in my, say, Divi builder, there's like content layering over content. It's a big jumbled mess. But when I look at it in my Chrome browser or in Firefox or in whatever, Safari, it looks fine. Like it presents well and it behaves well, like an accessible, responsive website. Do you guys find that it's different when you're building the site? It looks totally different.
Are you talking about using Elementor in this context?
Using Elementor, using Divi.
And you're finding that there's a big difference between the back end and the front end.
Yeah.
Back end when you build the thing, and the front end when you see it.
Like it's totally unreliable. Even if I put in my custom dimensions that I would like.
Yeah, but people have been saying though that Elementor is quite strong on the fidelity of its layouts and designs, making it to the front end. And that's interesting. I might just add that one of the things that's a huge limitation, two limitations of page builders, and Elementor in particular, is the bloat that they bring because of the way they work. It is not uncommon to have several thousand DOM nodes in a page, in a single page, which when you think about it, is just mind-boggling. But that when you see what is in effect a landing page built in the block editor, you have to laugh. It is so straightforward. It is so reliable. And since it doesn't require a page builder, you can, with 2 clicks, produce a copy that you can take and use on another site that has a completely different theme. Why? Because whatever you've done in the layout, which if it's a bunch of blocks, they'll call that a pattern, is in a state which when copied is just HTML code that any block editor for any theme can take and process with no problem at all. That is such a world of difference compared to the current situation with page builders that it seems to me, something really, really valuable. Granted, you can't do it exactly today, but there's enough available today to see how it will work. And also, for example, you've modified, you've customized the theme. You can now, with a click, export that theme and import it into another site, and you just become a theme developer, in effect. That was completely impossible in the PHP-based world of classic WordPress. Now, not to be a proselytizer beyond any reasonable level, what I'm saying is that the limitations of page builders from a technological point of view are to some extent being addressed, but that process isn't finished. And therefore, there's always a chance that Gutenberg won't make it somehow to September, October, November, December, when a series of releases will occur. But that having gone through, what, 3-4 years now, where these changes, improvements have occurred, there's a reasonable degree of confidence that these guys have some idea of what they're doing. But that question of fidelity, front end and back end, I thought was pretty much resolved in favor of Elementor and Beaver Builder and so on. But you're saying not in your experience.
Well, as I said, Elementor I find is it has the least problems I have is with Elementor. Was a couple of my client sites are Divi. They were built on Divi. They came to me using the Divi framework. And everyone I talk to, they're like, oh, stay away from Divi. Say no to those clients. Can't say no to those clients.
Yeah, Divi's still pretty popular though.
Yeah. Like when they send me a PDF design and they're like, I want it as pixel perfect as possible. Like sometimes it's really easy. I find Divi, all of these page builders quite powerful in order for me to get from point A to point B in the amount of time. But it just seems so fragile. I don't know. I feel very
when somebody sends you a PDF, or in the old days, a Photoshop file, that's really not the web way of thinking and doing things. That is to say, if you build out of the core components that go into a website in as close to their native form as possible, which is what Gutenberg is about, just by the way, then you'll have much greater chance of success than something which requires a massive amount of tweaking, because you're not doing anything which the web was designed to do per se, but rather, yes, I mean, anything you can sketch in some design in Photoshop or Canva or anything really, any of the design programs can be built. But why would you want to, when in fact it has to be put together in such a gerrymandered, kind of constructed somehow sort of fashion? It takes you back to the days when layouts were controlled by tables, because there were no tools to sort of organize the placement of items in a layout. And then when we finally got rid of that completely, the world changed for lots of people. But I think the point is that if you wish to bend a website into a certain shape that it was never intended to be as a core kind of activity for its tool set, then you just bought a lot of headaches. And if clients think that they'll get a pixel perfect rendering, then they should be thinking of a triple or quadruple or quintuple budget to take into account the amount of tweaking and tuning and pissing about. And also that if that's what they're asking for, they're ignorant about many other things to do with the web too. So they're going to be a passel of headaches on all fronts because they're not learning and using the web using its strengths and capabilities. They're trying to do something and then say, well, let's make the web do this rather than let's work with the web and do what the web is good at doing. And then once that's running, grow from there. So getting a site up and running in a simplified, basic way that you can then learn from and then continue to develop is just a notion of an ongoing exercise that most people can't handle. They want it to be a project. They want to start on day one and some number of days later be finished, and that's it. The site is done. We don't have to think about it anymore. I mean, what a dumb idea. But how many guys do you know who work with clients who don't deal with that when it comes up? They don't identify.
I was going to say most of my
sorry, but you have maintenance, which includes backup and security and updates and hosting issues and new features and changes in the underlying plugins and theme enhancements that you may want to adopt and e-commerce that you might want to add and the picture gallery you haven't thought of yet, but you'll soon think of, you know, bam, bam, bam. Well, this is like, whoa, whoa, kind of thing. It's just not the way that people think about these things.
A lot of clients tend to think that a website is a billboard. You set it up and you're done, you forget about it. Rather than thinking that a website is a magazine and it needs new content every month.
Yeah.
You need a new issue every month.
Yeah. So that's where I find myself. Don't get me wrong. When I'm charging by the hour, I don't really mind all those things. Those are just my personal headaches. When I'm stressed out that these stupid builders aren't working. But yeah, that's interesting. I try and be forthright with my clients. If it's a fresh from the ground up design, I do have a designer who's privy to web design as opposed to graphic design and familiar with UX and UI design. So I always am supplied with the whole mobile suite, the whole responsive suite. So it's not too much guessing or trying to, you know, make miracles happen. But there are times when with the abilities of the builder, it just goes into this wonderland of a website that like is just going to be a monster for maintenance and upkeep and things like this. But that's what brings me back to my original thing. I'm thinking about developing turnkey websites, like super light, you know, almost back to how things used to be, static HTML websites, super lightweight. They only have certain functions, you know what I mean? They're designed to do just those 4 things, and you know, touch on, you know, some of the insights you guys gave me about the questioning that goes to the client at the beginning of the project, whether they need a gallery or they can work with just a brochure or whatever. I think that it all. Do you think that you know, these things will be differentiated in the future? Like there'll be a great divide between content rich websites and then some that are basically landing pages?
Well, I think a lot of small businesses are going to go the small landing page site just because of the amount of money that they had to invest. Larger corporations have the money to invest in the people to write the content. So you'll see big financial companies, for example, have dozens of staff writing hundreds of articles on their sites and have very information-rich sites because that's what attracts their clients.
Well, I think at the same time, sorry, Drew, we continue.
Yeah, but if you're running a plumbing shop, you know, you've got a business that people will often call when they're in a hurry, not because they're fascinated with plumbing.
Yeah, exactly.
I was just going to say that one category of business that for whom websites have proven to be very valuable from a marketing point of view are people with long sales cycles, where there is, the proverbial journey through a series of stages which CRM systems can track quite capably, where there's an initial sort of contact and a basic sort of understanding of where are you in this particular sort of grid of capabilities that the Gartner Group might put out. And how do you move people through a succession of stages in which they learn to identify what it is that they want, and then they read about different capabilities that you've got, look at it from the points of view of case studies or technical specifications and so on. But they're complex decisions that have a variety of inputs and usually at least a handful of people being involved. A website is an invaluable tool in those circumstances, in the same way that financial institutions, for example, that have very broad product lines, but a diverse set of market segments, well, they can tailor the content to a fair extent to the different segments and their different information needs and capabilities. in a way that they can't do in branches or with people, because it's hard to have like 5 different people waiting on a customer, because there's 5 different ways in which that customer could be serviced to good effect, but only one of them will work. And so this is the notion of personalization, which hasn't really developed as well as many people thought it would. But once again, websites have the potential to identify somebody with what they're trying to learn and understand, and with a fairly light hand, guide them to the information that they want. And in the process, move them to conversion at some point. There really isn't any other effective way to do that other than salesmen, who are the good salesmen are the most expensive talent you can buy. More expensive than developers by far, because they can produce a sale. That's money, right? Developers can make great products. Wow, terrific. But they don't come with cash built in, right? A salesman does. And so anything which can make the salesman job either easier or do some of the work of the salesman can have tremendous potential then from the point of view of efficiency and effectiveness. And given the fact that if you're selling outside of a city area, the travel costs of getting people to prospective customers compared to them using a browser to dial into your site and find what they're interested in or looking for becomes really important. And I think that the sort of distance aspect of sites, that they conquer distance, is something which those of us who can do a good part of our business in our own local area, as compared to, 10 years ago, for example, 95% of what I would do would be outside of Canada. And it wasn't just remote, it was remote work in the old days, where we worked remotely and then we flew in to a company for a week and a month for meetings and other things. And then you went home again for 3 or 4 weeks. During one period of 3 years, I think I spent every week, once a week, 1 week every month for 3 years going to Redmond. To the point where we actually leased a house and a car to accommodate the crew. But that was a wealthy customer who thought the talent that they put together, from all over the place, was valuable enough that they just didn't, okay, so there's a 50% cost increase because everybody's shipping in this manner. That's, but that's the difference working for wealthy companies in the enterprise space, that websites and 90% of the population that have websites aren't part of. It's a different world.
So one of the things that I learned over time is that people can't often imagine what they haven't experienced. So
Exactly.
one of the things that we do a lot of is, when we're working with people, is we show them examples and say, and you show them enough examples, and that there's lots of websites you can, that you show them enough examples that they can begin to imagine what their own site might be like. Those are easier customers to work for, in my experience, because they still have some flexibility than customers who come to you and say, I want exactly this design, don't you dare change it. Because often something that they want is not WordPress compatible or even internet compatible, and then you spend your whole life trying to work around it. I'd much rather deal with a customer who says, I think I have some ideas, can you show me some examples? There's a very famous photographer who does fashion work, and she always does the same thing with a new client. She gets the client to go to, when they're trying to figure out what they want the models to look like, she has 100 Pinterest images that she shows them and says, pick the ones which most appeal to you. And the narrowing process goes on very, very quickly, because people narrow from something they can see and imagine about. And I find the same thing works very well with helping people try to get their mind around what their site might do.
The impossible client is I don't know what I want, but I'll know it when I see it.
Oh, read my mind. You can't read somebody's mind. But even then, with those clients, I find that if you start to show them some examples, some of them at least will get a little bit more, yeah, that kind of looks like what I think I might finally want. And at least
I think what you're identifying though as well is that some people are not confident in something which requires them to use visual judgment, that they just haven't developed any ability to look at something and sort of process it in a kind of any systematic way. So to them, it's just like it's an image, right? But how do I compare the A with B? I mean, I can't. If you were looking at say a front page or home page of the site in a screenshot reduced version, and you put two of them side by side, for a significant portion of the people you might bring to that would simply find it not possible to compare them in any meaningful way to give you guidance that you could rely on.
And a common mistake that clients make is that they want a site that appeals to themselves when they really need a site that appeals to the client's customers.
Yes, yes.
Well, the whole persona-based marketing track, where a marketing agency will try to develop a persona, a picture of the customer that people want to attract, came out of that whole kind of effort. And again, so it's a question of, do you have a plumber who needs a site that people can go to and get some basic information or to get in contact with him? Or are you looking for someone who's trying to sell and has a picture of an ideal client? I did some work with my brother recently, who just invested in a major restaurant. Well, it took a while to get them to the point where they said, well, what we really want is someone who's young and looking to score. Now suddenly we had a persona, right? A picture of their ideal customer, because they wanted to sell a lot of booze in their restaurant, that we could start to work with, right? Getting the people to that stage where they can say, this is the kind of customer I want, if they're looking for customers, is really helpful, because then you can start to pitch ideas to them. On the other hand, if you're looking for someone who's I just want people to find some basic information about me, don't give them anything more than that.
Good insights, definitely.
Persona-based
Gentlemen,
marketing.
I have to sign off now, but thank you very much. It was a pleasure to listen in. I'm going to see you guys at the next Fix My Site WordPress meetup.
You take care. I'm also off. I guess we're pretty well finished for the evening, gentlemen, are we?
Yes, I think we
so
can
we're
wrap
gonna
it up
wrap it
now,
up,
guys.
yeah.
We've had an
Okay.
interesting discussion.
Mhm.
If anybody wants any final word or whatever, speak up now, or forever hold your peace.
The biggest
think-
source of hacker code, and I verified this through my contacts, the biggest source of hacker code in the universe are national security agencies engaged in hacking. That code, sooner or later, makes its way through the sociological process to the hacker community. It's an unbelievable process, but the NSA has done more to threaten our personal security than any other innovative code development organization. They cannot keep control of their own so-called secure code. It's an amazing phenomenon.
Interesting.
Well, that's a frightening thought to go to bed with.
But it's a reality, right?
Yeah,
And-
I can see
and
that. I can see
it
that.
really, truly, because they have the money to really innovate and experiment, and they can't, their people move on, and their people move on with the knowledge of what they've learned, and that threads its way into the hacker community.
Any final words, Drew?
Well, just to add to what Rolf said, I guess, and the Chinese are probably doing the same thing, and the Russians
Absolutely.
are probably doing the same thing, and so on.
We've actually done, I've done code tracing projects, and I've seen, situations where consultants who work for us, including consultants for big names, go work for someone else, right? And then we, for some reason, have access to the code, and damn it, it's the same bloody code. You cannot control the migration of code. It's a myth that you can control the migration of code, because you can't control the migration of people.
Or
I just have-
ideas, for
I
that
just have-
matter.
Yeah, that's true. And touching on just the idea point there, I have a friend. He was a financial exec in Manhattan. He's well up there. However, he wanted to go back to his kind of like digital coding roots. He applied at Google, all of the top places, Google, Uber, and everything. Uber did 8 interview meetings with 3 projects. And of course, he had to sign something that says all of your efforts are ours. We own all of this intellectual property or whatnot. And so when he was telling me about it, we were joking about how all of his great concepts on how to get like this particular type of user and use this type of technology, like software to make it all happen and everything. What if they just say, yeah, thanks, sorry, we're not going to hire you, but thank you for all your great ideas and all your pieces of
Yeah,
code. And
I
it was
managed-
interesting. Yeah, because like how much growth have they experienced internally based off of all of this influx and input of all these hopeful applicants who put their blood, sweat, and
Well,
every grain of their knowledge.
here's a thought on just on the question of hacking. I wasn't aware until recently. There's just a huge open source community supporting Facebook in a way analogous to what WordPress has, meaning that open source so that anybody can contribute, anybody can use the code. And you think Facebook, like what need do they have? What opportunity do they offer others to use the code that these volunteers contribute? And it just struck me as bizarre that, you know, they would exploit this sort of notion of open source and volunteers to become an extremely wealthy company that is known for its rapacious appetite for our personal data, and just chronically lies about it. Just it's part of their business model to lie about what they're doing, and make their annual trip up to Congress and to say, "Oh, we made a big mistake. We're really sorry, but it'll never happen again. At least not until next year when we return to say the same thing over again." And that when you stop and think about how bizarre it is for such a wealthy company to need free volunteer resources.
No, they don't need, but they're perfectly willing to exploit.
Yeah, exactly.
No, actually, I do think they need it because from a point of view of talent, they don't have enough talent. They can't buy enough talent. The volunteer community provides a form of innovation that is hard for big companies to replicate. And
No,
often they don't. So that's why big companies generally innovate by buying innovative companies and internalizing them, because it is virtually impossible in a large organization to do anything original for all kinds of reasons we've all experienced. And I think that's what drives Facebook has got to be as much as anything else, because otherwise it makes no sense. Anyway, on that note,
Yeah.
I get the last word.
There you go. Take care, guys.
Okay.
Okay, good night all. Thanks for coming.
Take care now.
See you again.